As a young Christian, the man that led me to Christ told me that one of the most valuable things I could do is memorize the Scripture. And man, I started doing it. As I've gotten older, and even some Christians have criticized me when I first became a pastor that I quoted the Scripture too much. I was trying to show off, and I kind of cut back. I would say probably the biggest mistake I've made in the Christian life is not keeping up my adamant memory of the Scripture. And I want to encourage all of you to do that. Pick verses that you can memorize. In my older age, Psalm 149:6 has become my favorite memory verse. Here's the scripture. I encourage you to read it. Let the high praise of God be in my mouth, and the double-edged sword in my hand. Now, I could talk about 30 minutes on that verse, but let me try to give you a quick rendition. Let the high praise of God be in my mouth. I've checked this out in the Hebrew, and that's the only place in the Old Testament that the term high praise is really used. Man, that must be something then, isn't it? The high praise of God, not just joy, not just praise, but high praise for what God is, something that captures me and overwhelms me. And so he says, let the high praise of God be in my mouth because I have the double-edged sword in my hand. Now, what is a double-edged sword? Studied that for several months before it came to me. And I heard the story of a woman's testimony who began to get on drugs when she was a teenager. I'd asked the Lord to give me an answer, and I was watching her television testimony. She said, when I was a teenager, I got on drugs, and then to support my drug habit, I had to turn in prostitution. And so that's my life, and I couldn't tell my folks, but I knew I was going downhill. And I asked some friends if they knew anyone who could help me, and they said yes, they did. It's amazing out of the friends I had that they should come up with this name. But I went to see him. He was a doctor. And he told me, yes, honey, I can help you with that drug problem. I could lick it, but you have a problem in your heart that's so big, there's such a hole there that only Jesus can fill it. And he led her to Christ. And she said, you know, it's wonderful now that I run a home for women, young women who have been trapped by prostitution and drugs. And it's because of that doctor giving me those two answers. And that's what we all ought to be. You see, this doctor had the secular sword, he had a spiritual sword. He had a cultural sword, he had a Christ sword, and they were both sharp. And so when you and I really have the sharp sword, where we can hack it in the secular world, we can hack it in the spiritual world sharp, we have high praise in our mouth. God bless you and give you that as we wield our double-edged swords.